Hi everyone, I'm Cal Spriggs. Today I'm going to show you all how I built a really cool Necromunda junker vehicle for use in Necromunda or any kind of post-apocalyptic sci-fi wargame. I started out the build with a toy car I picked up at a thrift store. This was an SUV and it had a neat luggage rack at the top and a heavy cowcatcher style bumper that I thought gave it a good wasteland aesthetic. With this entire build, I wanted to be making a vehicle that I could use for Necromunda, but also one that wouldn't be out of place in other post-apocalyptic settings. I thought this SUV had a nice look, and it wasn't too toy-like for these purposes. I started by taking it apart, as I wanted to remove the black plastic that it had for windows, since I was going to replace those. It came apart with just 3 little screws, so disassembly wasn't too difficult. I had to be careful to set those screws aside so I wouldn't lose them. The plastic for the windows was a separate piece from the rack, which was a bonus, so I knew I could get them apart without damaging things too much. It took me a bit of looking to see how they'd been attached to each other and the frame of the vehicle and to figure out how to take them apart. They'd been slipped together pretty tight, however, so it did take me some prying and twisting, which is fine, as the vehicle is supposed to show some damage anyway. The back latch holding them together came apart without an issue, but I could not get that front latch to come off. In the end, I just pulled hard and the plastic came apart. Don't be afraid to use a little muscle on stuff like this. After all, especially in a build like this, a little bit of damage adds to the character. I got the top rack off, and from there I was able to force out the windows fairly easily. After that, I put it all together again just to see what it would look like and to visualize any kinds of changes that I would need to make. The main part of the build here was replacing the windows with the kind of scrap readily available in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. I figured metal grating of various types, along with sheet metal in some areas. For the side windows, I used the mesh plastic used for needlepoint, often called granny grating. There are some different scales of the stuff, but I think this works well for the sides as it shows thicker grating used to provide protection, where limited visibility isn't as much of an issue. I measured it roughly and cut to fit, and then I realized I probably wanted to have the top rack glued on first. The plastic on these parts, as well as the granny grating, were all very smooth, which gave me issues with getting the super glue to stick throughout my work on the project. If you're dealing with these issues, there's 2 methods I've seen used elsewhere to improve the bonding. The first is using a bit of sandpaper to rough up the surface texture to give the glue a better surface to stick. The second is using baking soda sprinkled on the super glue to make it cure faster and stick better to the surface. I just used super glue accelerant, and you'll see that throughout the project I had issues here and there with parts sticking to me rather than the vehicle. I was trying to get it done quickly though, and that's the issue with trying to rush things, right? I ended up using quite a bit of super glue to get the side window to stay in place, hitting it with sprays of accelerant. Remember, when in doubt, P is for plenty, right? Like I said, I should have taken a step back and used one of those techniques to prep the surfaces a bit better. Learn from my mistakes. I measured and placed both windows again, and this time I used lots of glue. I have to admit I was a bit frustrated at this point with how things weren't sticking. I sort of wonder if there wasn't some kind of mold agent left on the inside of the toy car from manufacturing, as I had super glue on my fingers at this point, I had it on my tools, I had it on the workbench, pretty much everywhere. But the parts I glued still weren't sticking very well. In the end, I just used lots of glue and accelerant, and they finally did stick. With the side windows in, I evaluated where I was and what to do next. A lot of this kind of build is putting bits and pieces in different spots and seeing what works and what looks good. After I had the side window grating in, I realized the front engine needed something more. The whole vehicle looked a little too smooth and civilian. I had some plastic bits and debris left over from some of my other builds, and I put a big plastic gear and a plastic box in the hood to suggest a turbocharger and maybe some kind of air filter or something. After that, I used some finer screen mesh to make the front window. I used this as it would provide greater visibility and a bit of contrast with the thicker granny grating on the sides. Looking back, I wish I'd cut a section of the granny grating at a 45-degree angle and got more of a diamond grating look on one of the sides to give the vehicle a bit more of a mismatched appearance. With the curved surfaces and some of the odd angles, there's a lot of cutting and fitting to jobs like this to make sure everything goes together. You can see I had to measure it, place it, measure it again, place it again, just to make sure everything lined up the way I wanted it to. I will say that trying to get the screen door mesh lined up and in place and glued and getting the super glue to stick certainly added to my frustrations on this build. The screen mesh is very flexible, which made getting it to stay where I wanted difficult. The angles of the interior of the vehicle and the small surface areas involved added to my frustrations. On top of that, the super glue again didn't want to stick to the inside of the vehicle frame. Like I said, I suspect there was some kind of residue mold agent or something. With a small area to work with and the added complexity of trying to video all this while doing it certainly didn't make things easier. In the end, lots of super glue and hitting it with accelerant worked. Watching me fumble through this part is a great point to remind you to hit like and subscribe so you can see more of my misadventures when it comes to crafting. I did like how it looked though with that front and side grading in. Now I just needed to get something on the back to complete the look. One of the first tools I used for this was corrugated paper. After this gets painted up, it has a great corrugated sheet metal look, and a few small pieces here or there give a nice ramshackle feeling. I didn't want to make this look like an orc truck, so I kept the pieces squared off and put them on in a logical fashion to look like reinforcement and armor. As you can see, I had no issues getting it glued on the outside of the vehicle, and I started with 2 thin strips at the corners to look like bracing added to the vehicle structure. The great thing about the corrugated paper is it's thin, so I could shape it to the corners with no issues, and it holds against the plastic with super glue with no issues. I went with another section of grading on the back window. It was kind of on the fence about whether to just cover it over or not, but I felt like the drivers would want some visibility in the rear. For the rear side windows, I covered those over with thin strips of the corrugated paper. 2 small panels sell it that there used to be windows there that the Wasteland gangers covered over or armored up. It tells a bit of a story in that this vehicle was made for some other reason at some point and has been altered over time. With the main modifications done, I reassembled the video, putting on the bottom plate and the front bumper and screwing it all together. The main reason I had kept it apart until now was in case I needed to glue anything on from the inside, but with the windows done, it's at a point where I can just work on it all together. At this point, I chose to do some further modifications to the outside using cardstock and thin cardboard from a cereal box to add small sections of armored plate over the critical areas where the current owners would want to reinforce. I like using thin cardboard for this because I can bend it to shape fairly easily and it adds a bit of texture to the model and breaks up some of the flat panels. The driver and passenger doors got some extra armor as well as a spot on the front hood, maybe where someone hit it with a heavy weapon. At this point, I wanted to give it some battle damage, and I started to do that with my small drill, but I was pretty sure that the holes from this would just get covered up when I painted it. You can see me try a little bit, and I just wasn't satisfied. So then I got out the big power drill. I was pretty careful as I went along, as I didn't want to punch all the way through. I just wanted to make divots that looked like bullet impacts. That worked pretty well, and I tried to create patterns of impacts all along the sides of the vehicle so it looked like 2 and 3 round bursts of gunfire in a fashion that sort of made sense. I didn't want to make this thing look like Swiss cheese. I really just wanted to make it look like it had seen some hostile fire and kept going. So here and there, as I felt I needed to add more, I did, but again, I didn't want to put too much on this. I felt like the front needed a bit more, and this is where things went wrong. I didn't have any issues right up until then. I tried to put a hole in the front grille and I managed to drill all the way through the hole. At first I was tempted to leave it, but I really didn't like the look of that kind of hole. It didn't look like what a bullet would punch. I tried cleaning it up a bit, getting the scraps of plastic out of the hole and from around the edge, and kind of went back and forth about whether I wanted to keep it. It really just didn't look right, so instead I decided to patch it over with a piece of cardboard. Clearly, this was just some kind of further damage that the current or previous owners had repaired as best they could. In the end, it worked out pretty well. It looks like another bit of armored plate. With the armor and damage added, I got it primed. I used a bolt gun metal color as I wanted it to clearly be made out of metal. I wanted to have a painted, damaged, and rusted metal look. After all, this thing is getting used and abused for decades in the wastelands of Necromunda. I chose to use cheap craft paints on this, and I followed a technique that I'd seen online as far as using a lot of sort of stippling techniques and multiple layers to give it an unevenly worn and painted look. I foresee this vehicle primarily being used by the House of Iron when I play Necromunda, and Clan Orlok has blue colors, so it got a treatment with a primarily blue paint. This was my first real time using the stippling technique, and I'm not entirely sure whether I'm satisfied with it or not. The idea is to go over the surface unevenly and then let it dry, then come back again and then a third time to achieve a sort of haphazard and worn look. With the blue paint all over the bolt gun metal, I feel like I might have accomplished something similar, priming it a color and then coming back with metal and rust dry brushing, and a good brown or black wash. I don't know if this was faster either, as I had to let the individual times I painted it dry before I could come back again with the other passes. This technique weirdly required a lot of focus too, as I had to get coverage of the vehicle, but only in certain areas and not complete coverage. Dry brushing seems like it would be easier. I can go ahead and do that in just one pass, and then I can clean up any issues in a second pass. I don't know, I suppose I'll let you all judge the final product at the end. As I came through, I did the third pass on it, just making sure that I had coverage where I needed it and that it looked painted and not like a 5-year-old had been working on it. I think the intent of this technique is to create areas with lighter and darker paint, suggesting newer paint patches with older sections of fading paint. Again, I feel like I could do this with washes and gradients of paint. It doesn't really look like much when it's in progress, and there were a couple points where I was tempted to just prime over it and start over. That said, the layers added on and the wash at the end, it doesn't look bad. Once I got the hull painted, I went in and did the details. Most of the armored plates got red paint to match the House Orlok paint scheme I have. A few got yellow to show that they're scavenged parts off other vehicles to keep this thing going out in the wasteland. With the details painted, I went over it with a brown wash. I went really heavy on it to make some of the damage and divots pop, as well as to sell that this thing has been used hard in some truly awful conditions. This isn't your family vacation SUV. This is a wasteland junker vehicle that's out for blood. With that said, I didn't go the route of adding a lot of gothic, grimdark details on this thing either. There's no blood spatter or skulls. I want to keep it fairly neutral to be able to use it in other science fiction settings. One other thing I added, and I didn't show in the video, was a magnet on the top of the vehicle so I can use a magnetized weapon. I kept the gun off for most of these shots, but I wanted the option to be able to add it when I needed it in the game. Adding the brown or black wash to even a simple project like this is sort of the moment of truth. It adds that gritty detail and depth to the model, and it changes it from a painted toy into an actual miniature, or at least hopefully it does that and I haven't wasted all of my time and effort. I have to say I've painted probably thousands of different miniatures at this point, and I still often have to pause and consider whether what I painted looks any good with just about every one of them. I don't know if that's imposter syndrome or just dissatisfaction with my own painting abilities. In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter, as once they're complete, with most all of them, there's a huge sense of satisfaction at just being done. Sure, a detail here or there might annoy me, but most of the time I'm happy to have it done and complete. And here's the final shot. For some reason I put out my Delac gangers instead of the Orlok ones. Either way, it fits in with a good scale and it's suitable to the wastelands of Necromunda. I'm really pleased with how this turned out, and I've added it to the garage of vehicles I've assembled for my Necromunda games. There's more coming soon there as well. That's all for now. Please hit like and subscribe. I've got a lot of really cool crafting videos coming out soon, and you won't be disappointed. Thanks for watching.